Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. By now, you've probably heard about Emmanuel Macron's visit to China and meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing, as well as Ambassador Liu, the Chinese ambassador to France, his comments regarding the former Soviet republics. If you haven't, the ambassador said that the former Soviet republics, referring to a part in Ukraine but obviously having implications for the Baltic states, are not legitimate countries because, he alleges, there was no international agreement making them sovereign states. Now, aside from this being factually wrong, all countries in the United Nations have recognized the former Soviet republics. They've got constitutions. Many of them have joined supranational organizations, not least of which being NATO and the European Union. Aside from that, of course, it was provocative and outrageous. The Chinese government has sought to distance itself from those comments in recent days, and I'll read from one of the news articles that report on it, before providing what I see as a deeper analysis of what's really going on between France and China and the recalibration of French foreign policy and what it means for the Baltic region and indeed for the United States and the rest of the world. So the article I'm going to read from today is by Politico, and it's titled "China Sends Top Wolf Warrior Liu She to the Doghouse." For those that don't know what a wolf warrior is, it's essentially the Chinese equivalent of a hawk. So the US foreign policy establishment can be divided roughly into doves and hawks. Doves typically emphasize diplomatic efforts, foreign aid, international institutions, rule of law, soft power, so to speak, in managing US foreign policy, whereas hawks put much greater emphasis on the hard power aspects, the military capabilities, alliances, deterrence, the classic realist principle, something that I certainly would align myself with as well. And a wolf warrior is a Chinese counterpart to that. In fact, Wolf Warrior 2 is the name of a Chinese movie that in China was the highest grossing film of all time. What that film was about, it was set in the Korean War with the enemy being the United States. So Wolf Warrior has a real cultural value that everyone in China understands. So calling someone a Wolf Warrior has direct cultural relevance in that regard, a moniker that Ambassador Liu She accepts with some pride. Anyway, the article says, with friends like this, who needs enemies? Less than 3 weeks after French President Emmanuel Macron returned from a 3-day visit to China where he hailed common ambitions with Beijing, China's top Paris-based wolf warrior lashed out again. The outrageous diplomatic faux pas from Liu She, China's ambassador to France, where he questioned the sovereignty of former Soviet states on French television last week, was just the latest in a series of provocations. The Chinese ambassador has built a reputation for an at times flagrant disregard of diplomatic protocol, spreading disinformation and going a bit rogue on Twitter. Reading a bit further down the article, it says, French lawmaker Anne Genete, who belonged to Macron's party Renaissance, told Politico that the ambassador's remarks were completely opposite of China's official position on territorial integrity and that the discrepancies raised questions over China's neutrality over Ukraine. I'll quote this lawmaker, she says, "Is this a personal lapse or is this the first brick in a diplomatic change in China? I will be very vigilant as to China's future statements, even if they rectify his comments, which they since have. In the long term, the question is whether they get closer to Liu's position," she said. Meanwhile, François Godemont, senior advisor for Asia in the Institut Montaigne, tweeted, "The French government should analyze with lucidity why Beijing chose Liu She and why they keep him in Paris." Now this quote is quite interesting because it signals two different changes, one on the French side and one on the Chinese side. For China, now first it should be said that the foreign ministry has disavowed these comments. They said that their personal opinions don't reflect the views of the Chinese government and have reaffirmed that they support the sovereignty of all states, including former Soviet republics. So if you believe that, that's at least what they've said officially. But having such a high-ranking official in Europe make a claim that former Soviet republics, i.e. occupied countries that fought against foreign occupation and were recognized by the international community upon their liberation, making that statement is aligned with, obviously, the Kremlin's talking points and will allow China to have some breathing room when it comes to being neutral should Russia decide to expand its military ambitions into NATO and Europe in the future. And this brings us to France. Emmanuel Macron's recent visit to China was notable for two big things. One was widely reported on, and the other was not. Of the thing that was widely reported on, it was, of course, his comments related to any potential invasion of Taiwan and how France would respond, or specifically not respond. Now, before I go on, the French government, despite all the rhetoric about freedom of speech and defending cartoons and personal expression and so on, are actually very censorious when it comes to what journalists can report on. Politico sat down with Emmanuel Macron and had to agree to allow the French minders to edit what the French president had said after the interview and provide approval on what could go to press. Now, noting that fact, what was actually published was itself explosive. Specifically, Macron's statement that one of the things that Europe has to protect against is being quote-unquote dragged into something in Asia it's not a part of, obviously referring to any potential invasion of Taiwan by Beijing, keeping France and other European countries out of it. Now, apparently, the actual interview involved Macron saying things that were far more candid about that were cut from the final draft. And Politico made that comment explicit, said some things were taken out. We agreed to it because it was a requirement for getting access to the French president, even though it goes against our editorial guidelines. They did provide that disclaimer, noting that he actually provided comments that were not different to this, but in fact more dramatic. So what Macron is saying here is that France will not get involved in any conflict in Asia should communist China invade democratic Taiwan. Now, of course, the Anglo countries responded with dismay, the United States demanding all kinds of clarifications, which, unsurprising, were not particularly forthcoming. But from this fallout, there are two things that were revealed. The first is the character and nature of Macron himself, and secondly, the somewhat muted reaction in many European capitals to what Macron actually said. On the former, he is clearly personally upset with the Anglo countries, particularly Australia, Britain, and the United States. If you are unaware, there was a major submarine contract. The French were building the new generation of Australian submarines, the Barracuda-class submarine that were going to be diesel-powered submarines for Australia's future needs, but because the French are the ones that build the smallest nuclear-powered submarines in the world, there was always that possibility of deepening that relation and including nuclear power in some future development. Australia is a vast continent, needs nuclear-powered submarines really to cover that huge range, but also needs them to be quite small because the Australian continental shelf is large and the ocean around Australia is quite shallow relative to much of the rest of the world. One of the things that isn't talked about too much, it's not classified or anything, but one of the things that isn't talked about too much is that the Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines provided by the United States that they operate, they're 8,000 tons. They're quite visible when they're close to Australian waters, not necessarily ideal for defense of our continent. Now, on the back of this deepening military cooperation with Australia, the French put all of its eggs in the Australia basket for protecting French holdings in the Pacific. France has significant interests in the Pacific. It has French Polynesia, New Caledonia, many other places in the Australian region in the Asia Pacific. They have an interest in what happens there. And they were absolutely betrayed by the fact that Australia, Britain, and the US, well, they jettisoned the French contract for starters and then agreed that they would cooperate together to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines, essentially kicking France out of the room. Now, of course, there's an Australian side to that story, which is not really relevant to this. Suffice to say that Macron is personally aggrieved by the way its wayward allies have treated France. And if I was in his shoes, I might feel similarly in some respects. But he is taking it way too far to get revenge. He's gone to Beijing, he has kowtowed before Xi Jinping, and he is signaling to the Anglo countries that France is going to realign itself to accommodate an expansionist China in Asia, and making it explicit that France will have nothing to do with any contingency in Asia, including supporting the United States in any defense of Taiwan. And this personal grievance seems to be motivating Macron to a degree when he discusses his new doctrine of strategic autonomy in Europe, the idea that the Europeans must manage their own affairs and distinguish themselves from Washington, not get dragged into an Asian conflagration. And indeed, that would actually be reasonable if it seemed as though the European countries were taking the lead in defending Europe against Russian aggression or investing in their own military capabilities so that the United States could focus on Asia without being dragged into ever-deepening quagmires, for example, in Ukraine. But that's not what Macron really means. Indeed, after Putin invaded Ukraine, he was the Western leader, the NATO partner, perhaps most friendly to Putin in the days and weeks following that invasion. He refused to toe the line with the rest of the NATO powers to freeze Putin out of the international organizations. He continued to speak to Putin both on the phone and in person, ostensibly to broker a peace deal, but really making himself look like a bit of a fool. And my analysis of Macron's actions isn't that the French are going to lead on a revitalization of military power in Europe to deter and defeat any Russian aggression against NATO, but rather to change European foreign policy to separate itself from the United States and other allies, specifically when it comes to relations with Russia and perhaps being more accommodating over issues like Ukraine. Indeed, that's possibly why Macron is supportive of Xi Jinping playing a so-called mediating role in the crisis, because he wants to appease Russia to a degree and make sure that Russia can be friendly to Europe while remaining antagonistic to the United States. Now, Macron, I think, is being incredibly naive about all of this. The Baltic countries have it absolutely right. I think Macron thinks that the expansion of NATO to Russia's border, something that the French were never particularly supportive of, and indeed came out of the Iraq War, something that they were implacably opposed to, he sees that as a mistake and to an extent possibly views Putin's invasion of Ukraine as somehow legitimate. He may even sympathize to a degree the Chinese ambassador's comments. Just as he thinks that France shouldn't get dragged into a conflict in Asia, he probably doesn't want France to get dragged into a conflict in Eastern Europe either, thinking that it's not part of French sphere of influence. In other words, strategic autonomy in his mind means not supporting the United States basically in any way. Meanwhile, in China, I think it's pretty clear at this point that China is dead set, absolutely committed to invading and seizing Taiwan and reincorporating it back into the mainland. I don't think there can be any doubt about that. I'm utterly dismayed by some people who still believe that that is not an ultimate Chinese objective or something that the Chinese don't have a specific timeline for. It is without question that Xi Jinping will expect this to occur during his remaining time in office, that the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation as he conceives it, i.e. the reclamation of all territory that he sees as Chinese, is part of his legacy that he will be determined to enforce. And getting assurances from France and probably some other European capitals as well, Ursula von der Leyen, of course, escorted Emmanuel Macron on this trip, is no doubt one of the stepping stones leading to that eventual outcome. So what does all this mean specifically for the Baltic? Well, the Chinese ambassador's comments delegitimizing the sovereignty of Eastern European countries basically makes it clear that once China invades Taiwan, Russia will seek to expand its territory by pushing back into the former Soviet republics, i.e. the Baltic countries, on the basis that America will already be overstretched. There is one of the most influential and, in my view, strategically capable American thinkers, a very senior figure I've talked about on the channel before called Elbridge Colby, who strongly advocates giving Ukraine a secondary role in terms of building up the capability to deter and defeat China in a war in Taiwan. Now, his voice is the most senior, but hardly the only one. And what makes him unique is that he believes, unlike some others, that many of the same military capabilities needed to defend Ukraine will be necessary in defending Taiwan in terms of deterring the actual invasion. He argues against the idea that it's all going to be a maritime theater, it's all going to be air and sea, but rather China will actually invade Taiwan, and therefore to repulse that invasion, the same military equipment that America is sinking into Ukraine will need to be used in Taiwan instead. In other words, the fact that America is bleeding its technology into Ukraine is making a war in Taiwan more likely because it serves Chinese military objectives. And while some could quibble with that analysis in various respects, it's certainly the case that China has benefited immensely from American distraction over the recent decades. When George W. Bush became president of the United States, there were multiple crises with China. It looked like there would be a new Cold War tension all the way back in 2000, 2001. But then, of course, in September of that year, we had the Twin Towers, 9/11, and after that, the War on Terror. All of the United States apparatus was focused on the Middle East, and even the relationship between George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin became incredibly warm. The United States had hitherto been deeply critical of Russia's genocidal war in Chechnya, but the Russians simply said that they were fighting Islamic extremism, something that the Americans now felt deeply sympathetic to. So they walked hand in hand during that War on Terror period. Meanwhile, China, completely unencumbered by any American interference, just deepened its economic engagement with the United States, continued to ship jobs and manufacturing to China, export-led its economy with 10% compounding economic growth, and immensely increased its total national power. When George Bush went into Iraq in 2003, the United States economy was 8 times the size that of China. We're now at a point where when China invades Taiwan, perhaps the end of this decade, China's economy will be larger than that of the United States. That is how dramatic this power shift has actually been, and how beneficial American foreign policy distraction has been for Chinese ambition. Something that China now wants to maintain in perpetuity with its junior sidecar partner, Russia. That when China invades Taiwan, one of the calculations that it will make is that Russia will simultaneously invade Eastern Europe, and moreover that Americans will be more instinctively sympathetic to its European friends than some distant country in the Pacific, something that the United States indeed doesn't even recognize as an independent country. So Emmanuel Macron is really just serving that agenda. He sees himself as a stupiditarian thinker, but he is in an environment of sharks, and I think he's kind of out of his depth when he's doing these sorts of things. He should think more deeply about what he's doing. I know that he is personally hurt by the spurring from the Anglo countries. I think from a French perspective, they're never going to be part of the Anglo family. They'll never be invited to Five Eyes, intelligence sharing, etc. They will always see themselves as the distant Gauls. And I can understand that. The French have a strong sense of cultural identity, a strong sense of linguistic primacy. The fact that English is taking over the world is no doubt, a serious problem for the French. But if I was to be sympathetic to Macron, I would say that his recent experience of being betrayed, so-called, by the Anglo countries means that from his point of view, France could be dragged into conflicts that it has no direct interest in except to preserve American hegemony, while America itself won't respect France enough to allow France to deepen its own relationships with countries like Australia. Again, I think he is personally reacting to this, not thinking about it in a clear-sighted way. I think the Chinese are playing a very sophisticated game. We're in the countdown to conflict right now. I think we are on this train. I don't think anyone is getting off this train. We will have an invasion of Taiwan in the next few years, and we're all going to be bearing the consequences of that. The best thing the Baltic countries can do is what they're already doing. They're deepening their relationship with countries that will support them against Russia, specifically the United Kingdom. I do think there should be a separate military alliance relationship with the Nordic countries and Poland and UK that are distinct from, separate to NATO, something that perhaps the Ukrainians will be able to join immediately upon cessation of hostilities, or perhaps even when hostilities are still ongoing, and that the Baltic countries make preparations right now to defend their territory from any potential Russian invasion. It's easy to think that, we've overestimated Russian power, they can't even pacify Ukraine, how are they going to take on NATO? Well, they won't take on NATO while the United States has a strong presence in the east of the continent. But when they're facing a peer competitor in China, they're in a hegemonic conflict in the Western Pacific, the Russians may have a very different calculus, particularly if they believe, potentially rightly, that the French won't intervene on the Baltic behalf. That's my view. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them down below. Happy to have this discussion with anybody. I think it's the most important subject in the world today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.